this is sub-item reporting explained in detail inside of monday.com. So I'm going to walk you through what can you report on with the sub-items and the issues and workarounds that we have when trying to report on sub-items inside of monday.com. By the way, if you'd like us to help you set up monday.com for your business, check out the link in the description below. Anyway, as you can see here, I'm inside of our example monday.com system. Now, like I said, in today's video, we want to be able to report on sub-items and how those reports can work with sub-items, the issues you might run into, and the workarounds. So what we're going to go ahead and do is create a new board. That's a document, so don't want to do that. Try again. Create a new board. I'll call this example board. Privacy options, obviously, it's entirely up to you. Main, accessible to anyone. Private, only you and select individuals. And then in this instance, I'm just going to leave what we're managing as items and hit create board. Cool. This is kind of step one in the process. This is obviously where the data is going to live inside of your system. So whatever board that you're working on, obviously there are going to be sub-items associated with that board or those items within that board. And then we want them to be able to roll into or roll up to a dashboard. So what we'll also do is go ahead and create a new dashboard here. And I'm going to go ahead and call this example dashboard. Now, you can report directly on the board, but I would typically always recommend you creating a dashboard and then pulling in the boards that you want to report on. For instance, we want the example board to pull into our example dashboard, obviously, right? So now when we go back to our example dashboard, we can go ahead and start messing around with the sub-item functionality. So I can go ahead and add a new sub-item, and let's just keep it really basic. And I'm going to go ahead and put in example sub-item. And then we have a few different data points associated with the sub-item here. Now, if I then go to my example dashboard and go and add a widget, and let's say a chart, for example, you'll notice that obviously the data will automatically populate. If we go to the three dotted button and then settings and then go to our x-axis, you'll notice that we have here sub-item columns. So we can remove columns and just report on sub-item statuses. Okay, so you can see here on pretty much every report, you'll have a drop down for columns and you'll have a drop down for the sub-items associated. Now, if you have multiple boards, it will be the board columns and then the sub-item board columns. And then if you've got multiple boards, it'll be the same again for every single board that you have. You have two drop-down options, both items, and that's obviously on the item level, and then columns on the sub-item level as well. So to walk you through that again, you would go all at once, one by one, is this. So you go x-axis one by one, use sub-items, for example, board, select the x-axis that you would like. So in this instance, let's say the status, and then y-axis, you would want to go one by one as well. Or you could do all at once, but you would untick columns and select count of items, or you go one by one and just count of items. Okay. So now it's going to show you the count of items of the sub-items that are in that particular status. So if I then go and add another sub-item, so I call this example sub-item number 2, hit enter, and then I'll change this, or let's add a new label, so 1 as an example, right? So if I change this to 1 and then go to our example dashboard, we've got 2 sub-items on our example board, and we can see the status of each of those sub-items irrespective of the parent item, might I add. Okay, so that's quite a critical point to note. Now this can then be applied for literally anything on a sub-item level. So we could have a numbers column here. So we go numbers and we could go 5,000 and then we could go 20,000. So imagine these are line items, and then we can three dotted button settings, customize, put that in a currency of some description, and then go to our example dashboard and we could go to add widget, and then we could go to a chart again, and we could see, okay, let's go sub-item value. By status again, so same principle applies, three dotted button, settings, and then our chart type could be, let's say, a stacked bar graph. Our x-axis in this case is going to be the status of the sub items. Our stack by could be the owner, and then our y-axis, or we could do it the other way around, or we could keep it simple. I'm kind of just making this up as I go along. You probably can tell, but you've got sub items of example board, y-axis, let's say 1 by 1, and it's the numbers column on the sub-items board. As you can see, sub-items of example board. So now I can see the sub-item value by status, and this is across sub-items. So it reports relatively similar as it would on an item level as well. So reporting functionality is not necessarily limited. Now, there are constraints that we'll come on to, but as we continue to explore this, hopefully you get the idea as to how simple it is. So if I then go to my example board again, and let's add my owner as myself. So we go x-axis is owner stacked by the status, and then the y-axis is the numbers. So we go add widget again, chart. So same principle, 3 dotted buttons, settings. Our chart type is going to be a stacked bar graph. Our x-axis in this instance is going to be, what did we say, the owner? Yeah, we did say the owner, didn't we? Yeah, and then stacked by the status of the sub items. And then our y-axis is going to be the numbers on, and we don't necessarily need that. So all at once, well, we would just go example board. As you can see here, we've got the owners of the sub items, and then the value associated as well, stacked by the status. So you go 3 dotted button, you could even go stack by and then expand the stack. So you could expand it by status. So again, the reporting options are really, really similar between sub items and parent items inside of Monday.com. They never used to be. I would say it's got a bit more advanced. But all you need to do is just select on the x-axis as opposed to going to the parent item, just select the sub items. Now, where it does get complicated as well is if you're trying to report on both item data and sub item data. So let me give you an example. So if we go example board person, sub item of example board owner, so that's the person column, and then we go status of parent item and the status of sub item, and then y-axis is going to be, let's go ahead and emulate what we've already got. So if I then assign this to myself, change the status of this to AA, and then go to our example dashboard, I would begin to expect this to go wrong, which it has done because now it's saying $3 and is completely bypassing the sub item functionality. So my recommendation to you is, if you're doing sub item reports, just make them exclusively sub items. If you're doing item reports, just make them exclusively items. It gets a little bit confusing when you're trying to do both things in one report. Okay, so that's just something to bear in mind. Now, what you might also then look to do is complicate matters further, which is typically inevitable. And let's say we wanted to do a formula column. So I'm going to give you an edge case of where things go wrong. So we would do, let's say, another numbers column, and we'll call this quantity, because quite often sub items are quite good for line items. So go quantity and then numbers column, which could be the per item value. And then what we would do here is we would go and add a formula column, and then this formula column is going to work out quantity times per item value. So quantity times per item value. There we go, and just hit enter there. So this in theory should then give us whatever our quantity is. So if I say 10, so it should give us 50,000, right? Which it has done there. So this is total value. Now, where it gets complicated is if you then wanted to mirror this up, but you also wanted to say 20 of this, so that's 400,000. We then want to go ahead and show summary on parent item, which is giving us a total value of this particular item based on the line items added as sub items. So now we've got a total value of 450,000. The reporting functionality can get a little bit weird. So if I just add a numbers column as an example and go to the 3 dotted button, go to settings, you'll see here we've got the total value, right? Which is based on sub items. But if I select sub items total value, it just shows me a number of 0, despite the fact that on our example board, it says 450,000. The reason being is because it's quantity times per item value giving us a formula. A formula then mirrored usually goes wrong. Now, this is some secret sauce for you. What you can then do is you can go ahead and add a formula column, okay, on your parent item, and you can go ahead and just put in sub items total value. And what we're essentially asking Monday.com to do is mirror over the data from here into a formula column. Just press insert. You can even then set the currency if you want to. And then you could go ahead and just hide the column summary. And now if we go back to our example dashboard, 3 dotted button settings, and change it to a formula, we can pull through the value. Then we could change this to the dollar, manual, 2 decimal places, and that's exactly what we want. So The limitations that you might face, you can overcome typically with a formula column, okay? Another example of this is if I wanted to show the summary of the status on the parent item, we can do. So then we could go ahead and we can report based on the parent item as opposed to the individual sub items. So if I go ahead and add a widget, let's make this a chart in this particular instance, and I'll just put this up here, 3-dotted button settings. And then our x-axis is going to be the sub-item status that's mirrored up from the sub-items onto the parent item. So you notice I'm on the example board, not the sub-items of example board, but the example board itself. And then obviously you can do count of items. You could do, this is again where it gets a little bit confusing. You can't split it because it doesn't work that way. So you would obviously want a y-axis based on something, right? So your y-axis could be based on the status, for example, not the status, like the count of items, and then our x-axis is the sub-item status. So if you then have another item, so let's add, or another item with sub-item number 3, and then this is equal to that particular status, then you'll see here how this works. Okay, so it takes into consideration all of the items where there is a mirror of sub items. So there's a lot of messing around to do, but what I wanted to show you in this video in a nutshell was you can report on a sub item level. So that's quite easy to do. Trying to report on both a sub item and an item level is usually complicated and things go wrong. And then mirroring data up from a sub item level onto an item level is entirely possible up until you're using formulas on a sub item level. Then you would need to mirror up and then cast data into a formula column, and then it becomes accessible again. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's look at some real life examples now. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of this because these were just walkthroughs of things. So let's look at, if I had 5, let's add, I don't know, like a priority column on our sub item level. So now I want to see the priority associated with all of my sub items. Okay, so this is really easy. You go add widget, you go chart, and then I would want to see the count. Well, let's just make sure I'm clear on what we're doing here. Count of sub items by priority. Okay, so settings, our x-axis in this instance is the priority on the sub item level, and then our y-axis is 1 by 1 and it's count of items. Okay, so now I can see the count of items or sub items by priority. So if I then change this to critical as well, the critical level is going to be 2, the high is going to be 1. Okay, so that's really, really simple. Now, if I also then wanted to be able to report on, let's say, the average value of a sub item, so we go average sub item value. So this is, again, pretty easy, right? 3-dotted button settings, we would go 1 by 1. And then in this case, we don't want the sub-item's total value. We would want to select the total value on the sub-item level, which would still give us the value that we're after. And then we would go ahead and press average, probably manual, 2 decimal places, and then the currency that you're working in. So I can see across all of the sub-items, our average is 150,000. Now, if you then wanted to take this a step further, you could then also just filter by group as well. So it'd be and only show me where these sub items are equal to this particular group. So you've got average sub item value here. Okay. You can then also do exactly the same, which would be, let's say, total sub item value. So same principle would apply. Total sub item value. Hit enter if I can spell correctly. 3-dotted button settings, we go 1 by 1. Again, we don't want the parent item level. We want, well, in all fairness, you could look at the parent item level, but again, for keeping things clean, I would probably just work on sub item. So sub item, this is the total value of all of the sub items. And then you go currency, manual, 2 decimal places. Now I think that and that is the same, but I'm just going to delete this because this was obviously an example. So I'll move this over here. So we've got total sub item value. If I now go to this particular sub item, which is on a separate item, by the way, and add this as 50 and per item value is 25,000, that's going to give me 1.25 mil, which is now possible to see the total sub item value, and you can see how the average sub item value has changed as well. Now, this can literally be applied to anything, right? So you could also look at count of sub items, count of sub items. So 3-dotted button, settings again, and then you would go one by one, and then it would just be count, and then not one by one, it'd just be count up the top. But of course you would want to unselect items and select sub items. Okay, you can then customize it again, same principle applies. If we were looking at an average, so if we wanted to then go ahead and add, let's say, a date column on our sub item level, and then another date column, and this could be date created, dates created, and this could be, let's say, date closed, I don't know, as an example. And then we had a formula column, and then we go average times close. So give me the difference in days between date created and date closed, and hit enter. Then we get an average, or at least we get a figure for each sub item. So let's say this was the 8th to the 16th, this was the 1st to the 17th. You can see we've got some data here now, and we call this TTC. Then we could go to our example dashboard, and we could go numbers again, and then we could go TTC, sub item, or go average sub item time to close. So this works exactly the same as it would on a parent item. Again, settings, columns, one by one. You'd want the TTC, you want to customize, average, manual. You might have one decimal place here, and then the unit's going to be days. So you can see on average it takes 12 days across all of the sub items. So that works perfectly. Where you run into issues is obviously where you are trying to merge sub items with items in one report. That's usually a bit of a disaster. And then if we wanted to look at the sub item status or any data that's mirrored up from the sub items, we can do. Arguably, it's easier to just report on a sub item level. But then if you are using formulas down here, so this is another great example, right? If I show the summary of the parent item of the TTC, which I've just done there, it gives me a total. I can go to customize, and I could ask it to give me an average, so it will match the average here. Now, if I then go to sub items TTC average, so this is a perfect example. In fact, average sub item time to close is currently mirrored from the sub item level. If I then use the formula and mirror it onto the parent item, you can see here it's going to give me 0. So what I would need to do in an instance like this, again, because it's sub item formula to mirror, so sub item formula to mirror on the parent item, it's going to throw an error for my reports. You just need to add a formula, as you can see here, and then I would go sub item TTC, hit enter, and that will then mirror across onto here, which gives me a value of 12, which would then allow me to go 3-dotted button settings, and then I would just select formula number 1. But what you will notice at the moment it's set as an average, so I would just do a sum. Okay, so be careful with how you are configuring this, but you have options. Needless to say, the cleaner way of doing that would be to take an average just from the sub item level itself. But there might be reasons why you would want to take it from the item level based on other data points or other filters that you might be using. So you know, you got options. So if I go customize and then change this back to an average, that would give me 12. Awesome. So those are the numbers. And then again, we can assume exactly the same for all of our charts as well. So we've got our chart here, 3-dotted button settings. We could go x-axis would be the sub item priority. And then our y-axis would be one by one. And then we've got our sub items of example board. And then in this case, let's select the total value. So we can see the total value by our priority on the sub item level. Okay. So we should just change this report to value by priority. Now you couldn't do that if you wanted to mirror up. Okay, so let me show you an example of why you couldn't do that. So if we go chart and we go status, so sub item, I'll just call it status or value by status. Okay, so we go 3-dotted button settings, and then our x-axis one by one could be the mirror up of the sub item status. Our y-axis could be one by one, and then we would go, let's say, sub item total value. Has that worked? That has worked. We go formula actually. I'm amazed that that's worked. So we've got sub item total value formula here. Yeah, that does seem to have worked. So this has actually, I mean, I'm learning stuff as well, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. 1 is 450, AA is 450. So let's just double check that. So we go, that's 1.25. That's 400. Yeah, okay. So no, I knew there was an issue. What you're probably seeing here is you've got on the example board, you've got an AA, and that's giving a total value of 450,000. Now, it's then showing that both of these status options are equal to 450,000. But in actual fact, they're not, because it's 50,000 for AA and 400,000 for one on the status. You see how that's then connected. Now, if we go here, you can see that we've got this value, which is 1.25, but that's working because there is only one sub item. But if I add another sub item, number 4, and for example's sake, let's just say quantity of 1, value 50. The value is 50, okay? Well, actually, let's do 50,000. So it should make 1.3 mil, right? So now you can see that both values are equal to 1.3 million. That is not the case, obviously, because one's equal to 50,000 and one's 1.25 million. So what we would need to do in this instance is x-axis would need to be your status, and then your y-axis would need to be your total value, and then it would work correctly. Okay, so if we go to our example dashboard here, and you're probably wondering why is this not putting through, it's because this is not a this is essentially what's called an empty value in Monday. But if you go to settings and then go to y-axis, is it y-axis? I think it's customize. Yes, customize, and then press show empty values, then that will appear as well. Okay, now you're probably also noticing that it's not split by parent item. So if we wanted to see the values by parent item, you could stack it. You could probably go x-axis, let's try this, name, and then stack by 1 by 1, and then it would be, let's say, the sub item status, and then our y-axis could potentially be the total value. Yeah, so that, I mean, that works. The stack by does not appear to have worked though. So again, reinforcing the problem of trying to mix item reporting with sub item reporting usually goes horribly wrong. But I could go into a great amount of detail on this, or more detail, and there are more nuanced edge cases. But if we wanted to do sub item value by status, very simple. Bar chart, x-axis is going to be the status, and then our y-axis is going to be total value on a sub-item level, and then our customize is going to be whatever, show empty values if you want to. Value by status, that should be working. Go to settings, y-axis, I might just switch that, so total value, y-axis, yeah, status there. Customize, show empty values, doesn't appear to be showing empty values, which is a bit odd, but Monday does have a bit of a glitch with that. So if I then change this status to AA, you'll see now that this has gone up, okay, because the AA value across all of the sub items is higher because there are 2 sub items that equal AA. Got 400,000 in one and 1.25 in empty, or just orange, I guess. I'm not giving a value to or a name of the status option. So my point being that just reinforcing this, sub item reporting works really well if you just report on the sub items exclusively. If you want to report on sub items on an item, you are far better to roll up the information, but then you have some limitations in of themselves. Okay, you can circumvent some of those issues by using the formula columns, but it's not a perfect solution, especially when you're looking at like sub item status stuff. Also, if I were to be looking at effort, so let's say effort is defined by the number of days that it takes to do a task. So we would have, let's say, a numbers column here, and then we would have effort, and let's say this task is meant to take 2 days, and this is 1 day as an example. So the value is now, if I show on the summary, sub items effort, the total value is 4. We couldn't see the split by priority of the sub items or the status of the sub items. So again, you'd have to report on a sub item level. Cool. Right. I appreciate I probably rambled on enormously, and this is more confusing than it was at the start of the video, and I might not have helped you at all, but hopefully I've taught you some valuable stuff here. Keep everything on a sub item level when using charts and dashboards. Obviously on a dashboard, you can have sub item charts and also item charts. There's no issue there. And then you can roll information up. If you're using formulas, use a formula on the parent item as well, and just be mindful of some of the limitations with the other like mirroring data points as well. If you would like us to help you with this and maybe try and unconfuse you somewhat, check out the link in the description below. Book a call with me. We can have a chat about how we could potentially help you set up this or issues that you're dealing with. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I will hopefully see you soon. Thank you and goodbye.